Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started. Let's get it started in here. Let's get it started. Let's get it started in here. Good evening. Oh, come on. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for standing out tonight. Thank you, Credit Suisse, for opening your home to us. Full disclosure, 23 years ago, I had the good fortune to be head of corporate communication for an investment bank that was then called CS First Boston because Glass-Steagall did not permit us to utter the phrase Credit Suisse with the phrase First Boston next to it. And then post Glass-Steagall, you could actually utter the forbidden name, which has since been somewhat subsumed, but I feel like it's an old homecoming. So thank you for welcoming me back to where I cut some teeth and some other things in the late 80s and early 90s. I am Fred Garcia, and by day and often by night, I am the executive director of the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership. In that capacity, I have the good fortune to work with and coach senior executives around the world. More than half of my clients are in financial services, including some of your bosses, and even some of you. And thank you, those who are my clients, for coming back out. I also am a professor of management and communication in a number of universities around the world. My primary academic post is at New York University, where I teach in both the Executive MBA program and in the Masters in Public Relations and Corporate Communication program. I'm on the leadership faculty of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland, where I teach in the Masters in Advanced Studies in Crisis Management and Security Policy. And I've just finished the stint as a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University in Beijing, where I taught crisis management and leadership skills both to graduate students and to members of the government and various government ministries. And I've had the good fortune to work in 42 countries on 6 continents, and it's a fun job, and I'm delighted to do all of that. Thank you for investing some time here today. What I want to share with you is something I share with my clients and students wherever they may be, and that is foundational principles for winning hearts and minds and inspiring trust and confidence by exercising the leadership discipline of being good at engaging stakeholders well. Engaging stakeholders well is a leadership discipline that is often ignored or discounted or marginalized by leaders to their peril. And I hope to share with you today both some concepts and some tools and some tips to help you become habitually strategic when engaging those who matter to you, whether they're those up the chain of command, across, down the chain of command, business partners, and others. How do you get them to want to do business with you? How do you get them to have trust in you, have confidence in you, and how do you lead them effectively? Much of what I'm going to share today can be found within the covers of my most recent book. I'm not here to sell books, although there are some limited number of books for sale in the back. I can give you free of charge a summary of the book in the form of 10 cards, each of which focuses on a particular leadership principle, only a couple of which I'm going to talk about today, but they're free of charge on the back counter. I wrote The Power of Communication, Skills to Build Trust, Inspire Loyalty, and Lead Effectively to help leaders be better at exercising their leadership discipline. And in the book, I focus on 3 things. First, what works and what doesn't work when leaders need to inspire trust and confidence. What works and what doesn't work when leaders need to win hearts and minds, in particular in high-stakes situations. What works and doesn't work in high-stakes situations. We're going to talk about some of that today. The second thing I do we're not going to talk about today, and that is I have taken a military manual. I've taken the first doctrinal publication of the United States Marine Corps, and by changing just a couple of words, have translated it into a conceptual framework for leaders to understand how to be truly strategic. Now, warfighting, United States Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication number 1, despite its title,
is not about fighting wars. It's not about fighting, and it's not about wars. It's about understanding goals, understanding how to accomplish those goals, and understanding how to organize activities in order to move constantly towards the accomplishment of those goals. And one of the things I found when I encountered warfighting is the first paragraph of warfighting, by changing one word, gives us a really good understanding of effective leadership communication. The first paragraph of warfighting says, war, and I say effective leadership communication, is fundamentally an interactive social process, a process of continuous mutual adaptation, of give and take, of move and counter-move. Not a bad way to understand effective communication. Second paragraph. It's a mistake to think that your enemy, I substitute your audience, thinks the way you think, cares about what you care about, decides the way you decide. Leaders often assume that those they speak with care about what they care about. They don't. Know what they know. They don't. Make choices the way they make choices. They don't. And one of the disciplines of leadership is to care so much about those we are trying to influence that we meet them on their terms, not on our terms. And we get that, frankly, from the Marines. Isn't that a kick? The third thing I do in the book is distill all of it down into 9 principles of effective leadership communication, 9 ways to understand how leaders, 9 ways to think about how you, as a leader, can engage stakeholders consistently, persistently, well, and become habitually strategic in all of your engagements. Now, why does that matter? Warren Buffett told the Columbia Graduate School of Business about 4 years ago, if you can improve your communication skills, you can increase your value in the marketplace by 50%. I don't know what quantitative work he did on that. I know Warren tends to follow certain quantitative models. But in my experience, at least on orders of magnitude, I think he's got that about right. That when you look at those who excel as leaders, they commonly have consistently in common effective interpersonal engagement. We heard the word gravitas used in the other room, and my colleague and partner Raleigh Mayer is next door preaching the virtues of gravitas. And I encourage you, if you haven't had a session with Raleigh, please find an opportunity to do so. But the Center for Talent Innovation, about 4 months ago, published a report on what it takes to get the next promotion. And it surveyed senior HR executives, senior executives around sectors and around geographies, and concluded that 26% of any executive's next promotion is based on something other than the technical skills that the executive is required to exhibit, but rather on what they call executive presence. And they define executive presence in 3 ways. Now, this is their definition, not mine. They define executive presence first as gravitas. First, as the ability to project poise, to project confidence, especially under pressure, and to be decisive when people are looking to you for leadership. That's gravitas. Second, what they call communication, which they define not only as the ability to speak clearly, but more significantly as the ability to read a situation, to read an audience, to read a room, and to adapt based on the reaction of the audience. They have embraced, knowingly or not, the Marine Corps doctrine of continuous mutual adaptation, of give and take, of move and counter-move. And the third thing they point to when they talk about executive presence is what they call appearance, which is not the superficial appearance. In my case, do I have hair or not? But rather, does the package work? Does the person look the part? Does the person carry herself or himself the way one would expect the person in that position to carry herself or himself? I had nothing to do with that. I just observed it. But as I read their report, I thought, that's actually very consistent with my observations. And when we ask, why should we care about the things that we're talking about in these 3 rooms, I think that's a good answer. Because 26% of your next promotion is going to be based on these things. Having said that, today what I want to share with you over the next hour and 20 minutes or so is 3 ways to understand how to get consistently good at engaging stakeholders well. And I'm going to start simply by unbundling a little bit about 3 of the principles of effective leadership communication from the power of communication. The first is communication is not an afterthought in business. Communication is not a nice to have in business, but rather communication is an essential part of business. I call it the continuation of business by other means. We need to take communication as seriously as we take every other business function. We need to take communication as seriously as we take accounting, as seriously as we take finance, as seriously as we take HR, compliance, operations. We need to take communication as seriously as we take all of those other disciplines. But there's a challenge. We've been speaking since we were about 1 year old. We've been reading and writing since we were 4 or 5. We think we're already good at it. And unlike accounting, we don't leave the office and go to dinner and do accounting over the table, but we leave the office and go to dinner and communicate over the table. So we think we're doing it all the time, and therefore we must be good at it. But as I reflect on leaders who have career-defining meltdowns, it's often because they didn't take communication quite as seriously as they took all of the other elements of business. So we need to take it seriously. More about that in a moment. But the discipline of leadership and taking communication seriously is we need to work hard to be able to connect. We need to work hard to be able to connect, and that's often forgotten. The second principle that we're going to spend a lot of time on today is that we can't move people if we don't meet them where they are. We need to meet them where they are physically. Can they even hear us or see us? We need to meet them where they are intellectually. Are we speaking below them, at them, above their capacity? Are we speaking only about what we care about and not at all about what they care about? We also need to meet them emotionally. We need to meet them spiritually. We need to meet them in all of the ways that human beings experience each other. And leaders are often scared about connecting with people on the non-intellectual level. And I believe that as a society we have fetishized intellect and underplayed emotional connection, and leaders who do that to their peril. We're going to spend a lot of time today on emotional connection and how critically important it is for leaders across enterprises and at all levels. And then finally, the real discipline of leadership communication is to understand what human beings are even capable of. And when I look at massive leadership fails, it's because the leaders fail to appreciate what human beings are even capable of, especially what human beings are capable of under stress, what human beings are capable of when they're in pain, what human beings are capable of when they're anxious, when there's an environment of persistent change, when there's an environment of staff reductions, when there's an environment of economic insecurity. What are human beings actually capable of? And leaders who fail to connect by failing to understand what human beings are capable of are failing in their leadership burden. So that's what we're going to talk about today. In the meantime, let me introduce you to one of my heroes, and that is a young man named Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote one of the most influential books in Western civilization that most people have never heard of. Karl is purported to have written a book in 1832 called On War, or in German it's Vom Kriege. Karl was the chief of the Prussian General Staff. He was a child prodigy. He became a general at age 20 in the Prussian army. He fought against Napoleon. He led the Russian defense of Moscow in 1812. So when you hear the 1812 overture with the cannons and the bells, that's really a tribute to Karl. Karl, uncharacteristically for his age and for his time, fell madly in love with a woman whom he treated as his equal, as his confidant, as his life partner. She was educated. She was wildly intelligent. And when Karl died, suddenly, she took his notes and wrote Vom Kriege, but being 1832 in Berlin, she didn't get credit for it. Karl got the credit. But Karl Marie von Clausewitz wrote the definitive book on strategy. And all business strategy to this day derives from Clausewitz. There's a principle in On War that I think, just as with war fighting, by changing one word, gives us an insight on how to be effective leaders when we have to communicate, or when we ought to communicate. And it's this. Karl said, or Marie wrote, we need to see war as an act of will directed toward a living entity that reacts. Thank you, Allegra. War, say Karl and Marie, is an act of will directed towards a living entity that reacts. We can also understand effective communication as an act of will directed toward a living entity that reacts. Let's parse this. Effective communication is an act of will. It's always done on purpose. It's always done for a purpose. It's always done with a particular intent. And the metric of whether the communication succeeded is, did we accomplish our purpose? Did we accomplish our purpose? If our purpose is to enhance employee morale and productivity, did we? If our purpose is to increase demand for our products and services, did we? If our purpose is to restore trust in a difficult circumstance, did we? That's the metric that matters. But when I talk to executives and ask, how did it go? I hear things like, went great. They didn't have any questions. Went great. I think they liked me. Went great. I got through it all. But nothing about the audience. Nothing about, did they seem to get it? Are they talking about you the way you want them to? We need to start with the intent. And until we have clarity of intent, we shouldn't communicate. I spend more of my time with clients asking them, why are you going to do that? Why are you going to call a meeting of all of your employees? Well, it's the second Tuesday of the month. Yeah, but why? That's not your intent. It just happens to be the second Tuesday of the month. Okay, you have a policy of talking to everybody the second Tuesday of the month. What's your purpose here? And I keep hearing, well, it's the second Tuesday. What's wrong with you? We need to understand intent. Effective leaders start with understanding intent. Directed toward a living entity. Human beings aren't passive entities, but rather living, breathing human beings. They're not vessels into which we pour message. They have their own ideas, their own appetites, their own aptitudes, their own desire even to be in relationship with us, and we need to engage them as individual living human beings, not as undifferentiated masses simply to throw message against. It's not about telling our story. It's about connecting with their story. But leaders often fail to see audiences as living, breathing human beings, but rather as just that undifferentiated mass. We'll just send stuff out, whether it's an internal audience or an external audience. And finally, that reacts. Did we get the reaction we wanted? And we need to begin by who matters. What do they currently think and feel? What do we want them to think and feel? How do we get them to think and feel that? And when we're done, do they think and feel that? That's the way to understand the leadership discipline, but to get them to think and feel that places a burden on the leader. And it is a real burden on the leader, and the burden of leadership is to do this well. The burden of leadership is to get the audience to react the way you want it to. And today, we're going to focus on 3 ways to do that. Today, we're going to focus First, on how to meet people where they are and connect with them by really connecting. Then we're going to move on to manage meaning. And one of the things I find particularly in financial institutions, I also do a lot of work in pharmaceuticals, I find it about evenly in both financial institutions and pharmaceuticals, is we'll just tell people the facts. They'll get it. Leslie, you're doing this. You've heard that. We'll just tell people the facts. Yeah, bad idea. Human beings don't understand facts. They don't. Human beings understand facts embedded in a context. And if we don't provide the context, they'll provide their own. And it may not be the context we want. So the real burden of leadership is to manage the context. I'm not suggesting facts don't matter, but I suggest they're not sufficient and they shouldn't go first. They're not sufficient and they shouldn't go first. That's the second thing we're going to talk about. And then finally, we're going to talk about the physicality of audience engagement. How do you engage them in ways that get them to actually want to pay attention? It's a cold, drizzly Thursday night. So let's start with a little music. And I noticed you all looked up and stopped talking. And okay, everyone had a little bit of a look in their eyes. Okay, let's get started. That's just one example of how to connect with people physically, not just, all right, let's get going. With that, let's move on to how to meet people where they are and the leadership discipline of connecting with them. And leaders resent the need to connect, but they shouldn't. Leaders resent the need to connect, but we can't move people if we don't meet them where they are. So let's look at an example of a leader who deeply resented the need to connect, but realized that it was his leadership duty to connect. And we're going to look at what happens when intrusive social media changes stakeholder expectations. You know about intrusive social media, and you know how it changes stakeholder expectations. So we're going to look at intrusive social media that changes stakeholder expectations about how leaders connect from 1936. The social medium of 1936 was something called wireless. We still have that word. Doesn't mean the same thing. But the word was wireless, and wireless changed everything. Wireless changed everything. And there was a certain king of England named George V who had to connect with his subjects, and he hated it because it was so beneath him. But he knew he had to do it. And he also knew he was about to die. And he also knew that his oldest son probably wouldn't be king, or be king for long. So he needed to train his youngest son to become king. The youngest son had a difficulty. He had a speech impediment. He didn't like speaking in public, but he had to. Here is the old king tutoring the young king-to-be on the burden of leadership to actually connect. True story, as rendered in the King's Speech from 2011.
Sit up, straight back, face boldly up to the bloody thing and stare it square in the eye as would any decent Englishman. Show who's in command.
Papa, I don't think I can read this.
This devilish device will change everything if you don't. In the past, all a king had to do was look respectable in uniform or not fall off his horse. Now we must invade people's homes and ingratiate ourselves with them. This family has been reduced to those lowest basis of all creatures. We've become
cut out. We've become actors. We have to go into people's homes and ingratiate ourselves to them. We've become actors, and he didn't say that in a good way. I hear the same thing from CEOs all the time. Why can't I just do my job? Why do I have to always go out and talk to people? Good response. And my answer is, that is your job. That is your job. And in the film,
it's just amazing.
But you've had that experience.
Oh yeah, but it's still amazing.
It is still somewhat off-putting.
Yes.
Yes. And later in the film, the king, the younger king, when he becomes king, laments that every time he opens his mouth, the people thinks he speaks for them. What's wrong with them? But there is an expectation that when the leader speaks, the leader is speaking for the people whom he or she leads. That's the expectation. It's a burden of leadership. We have to take that seriously. So let's talk about how to do that. And to get into it, we're going to take a deep dive into the human brain. We're going to take a deep dive into the human brain, and here's the quick bottom line. Hearts and minds both reside in the human brain. Hearts and minds both reside in the human brain. If we are to win hearts and minds, we need to do it through the human brain. Hearts and minds are metaphor. When we talk about winning hearts, we're not talking about the cardiovascular muscle. We're talking about something else. But it resides up here. And to get to understanding the human brain, we're going to look at 3 different takes on what modern neuroscience teaches us. First, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of connection. Then we're going to talk about the neuroscience of distraction. And then finally, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of retention. How do we get people to remember what we need them to remember? So that's our agenda. Let's begin with the neuroscience of connection. A very kind person introduced herself to me as a volunteer to work the room today. May I invite you to, you're the volunteer? I'm sorry, what was your name? Audrey, can I ask you to come up here? And we were unable to get a table for our presentation, so I'm going to ask you, Audrey, if you could, to be my table. Sure. Can I ask you to just hold this right there? Now let me ask, Dana, yes. Can you verify that that's an actual lemon? It is not plastic, it's not clay.
No, it even has the...
It even has the sticker. I could have put a sticker on a thing. So here's what I'm going to ask everyone to do. Here's what I ask everyone to do. I'm going to ask you, whatever else you do, keep your mouth dry. Yes, I'm looking at you. Yes. Okay, thank you. She puts her water glass down. She is... Keep your mouth dry. Christine, you're going to keep your mouth dry. Okay, you're going to keep your mouth dry. So now, Audrey. Thank you.
That's a great knife.
It's a great knife. Yeah, it's ceramic, actually. Thank you for that. And now, if I can ask you to hold the lemon just for a moment. I need you to remember your job is to keep your mouth dry. Thank you, Audrey. Keep your mouth dry as... Thank you, Audrey. Thank you. You can, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, quick show of hands. How many succeeded in keeping your mouth dry? How many were unable to keep your mouth dry? Oh, you can admit it. Come on. What were you feeling?
Saliva.
You felt saliva. Who else felt saliva? What else did you feel?
Cringe.
I'm sorry?
Cringe.
You cringed. Say more about the cringe. Somebody said sour? You felt sour? You could feel the sour. Almost feel the sour. What else did you feel? Yeah.
Little tingles on the side of your tongue.
You felt tingles on the side of your tongue. There was a physical reaction. Okay, what else? Yeah.
Felt pain for you.
You felt pain for me. So you felt my pain. Okay, good. What else?
Different reaction. I had
Yeah.
a flashback to when I was 5 that I would do the same thing willingly.
So this is your Madeleine, your Proust moment. Right. Okay. So who else felt something that hasn't been articulated? Nadia.
Envy.
Envy. You want? I have another half here. And, yeah. Yes.
Concentration to keep my mouth.
You really had to work hard. And Leslie, I'm going to actually ask you in a little bit to remind me you said that. You needed to concentrate to overcome what the body did naturally. Yeah, what else? What else? Other thoughts? Audrey, you were up there sort of in the experience as well as observing the experience. What did you feel?
I was trying not to say salivate, and I was salivating.
And you had a hard task because you were holding stuff. Right. Okay, good. What you who felt something, you who salivated, you who cringed, you who puckered, you who felt some sour. Anybody actually taste lemon? Okay. Anyone else actually feel sour? Yeah. What you are experiencing is something called mirror neurons. You are experiencing something called mirror neurons, which are an evolutionary adaptation that allow us to feel what someone else is feeling. To feel what someone else is feeling. It is mirror neurons that allow us to experience what the English word empathy really means from the Old Greek. In ancient Greek, pathos meant feeling, emotion, passion, everything having to do with sensation. And the word em means with. So empathy in English literally means to feel with someone. Mirror neurons are the structure in the human brain that allow us to feel what someone else is feeling. And mirror neurons are an evolutionary adaptation that allowed us to be safe in proximity to others, so we connect with people with whom we are sharing an experience. And that's how we define ourselves as being part of a group, or part of a family, or part of a team. Mirror neurons are the way we experience other people and feel for them literally. I believe that Western society and business in particular and financial services, yet further in particular, has overemphasized the intellect in the workplace and underemphasized the power of emotional connection. I believe we need to reweight them. That we have in some ways fetishized facts and data at the expense of other things. But over the last 20 years, neuroscience has begun to look at the human condition and the human brain and has concluded we, since the Enlightenment, have placed too much emphasis on intellectual rigor and not enough on emotional connection. Among the places that you can now read all about this is the work of Dr. Richard Restak, a neuroscientist at George Washington University, who has popularized neuroscience in a number of books that are completely accessible for people with no scientific training. And his big point in The Brain Has a Mind of Its Own and other books is this: it is a mistake to think of human beings as thinking machines. Rather, we are feeling machines who also think. We are feeling machines who also think. Yes, we think. We feel first, and then we think. And the challenge for leaders is to connect emotionally first, and then move people through intellect. We need to connect emotionally first, and then move people to intellect. But the starting point is to understand that connection is not soft or weak or sentimental. Connection is part of the human condition. Connection is science-based. And even the most cynical son-of-a-gun executives who have told me, but this is all soft, this is all, they would use other dismissive language, as soon as I show them the science, they say, let me take a look at that. Let me take a look at that. And there is science. One of the books I recommend to my graduate students, and I would recommend to you as well, is a book by the economist Jeremy Rifkin, who has taken a look at Western history and rewritten Western history from the point of view of emotional connection. He says too much Western history has been written from the point of view of intellectual achievement. We need to relook at Western history from the point of view of emotional connection, but he uses the sciences as a way into emotional connection. And here is Jeremy Rifkin talking about mirror neurons and what they mean and how we ought to understand them.
In the last 10 years, there's been some very interesting developments in evolutionary biology, neurocognitive science, child development research, and many other fields, which is beginning to challenge some of these long-held shibboleths that we've had about human nature and the meaning of the human journey. But there is another frame of reference emerging in the sciences, which is quite interesting. It really challenges these assumptions. And with that, the institutions that we have created based on those assumptions, our educational institutions, our business practices, our governing institutions, etc. Let me take you back to the early 1990s, sleepy little laboratory in Parma, Italy, and scientists had a MRI brain scanning machine on a macaque monkey as the macaque monkey was trying to open up a nut. They wanted to see how the neurons would light up. So the monkey's trying to open up the nut, the neurons light up, and just by serendipity, and this is how science sometimes happens, a human being walked into the laboratory, I don't know if it was by mistake, and he was hungry, he saw the nuts and opened up one of the nuts and tried to crack it open. The macaque monkey was totally shocked because who was this invader in his laboratory? And he didn't move, he just gazed at this human trying to open up the nut, just like he had done a few seconds earlier. And then the scientist looked on the MRI brain scanner, the same exact neurons were lighting up when he observed the human being opening the nut as when the monkey opened the nut, and the scientists had not a clue as to what this was. They thought the MRI machine had broken. They then began to put MRI brain scanning machines on other primates, especially chimpanzees with our big neocortex. Then they went to humans, and what they found over and over again is something called mirror neurons.
Did you go find something?
And that is that we are apparently soft-wired, some of the primates, all humans. We suspect elephants. We're not sure about dolphins and dogs. We've just begun. But all humans are soft-wired with mirror neurons so that if I'm observing you, your anger, your frustration, your sense of rejection, your joy, whatever it is, and I can feel what you're doing, the same neurons will light up in me as if I'm having that experience myself. Now, this isn't all that unusual. We know if a spider goes up someone's arm and I'm observing it going up your arm, I'm going to get a creepy feeling. We take this for granted, but we are actually soft-wired to actually experience another's plight as if we are experiencing ourselves. But mirror neurons are just the beginning of a whole range of research going on in neuropsychology and brain research and in child development that suggests that we are actually soft-wired not for aggression and violence and self-interest and utilitarianism, that we are actually soft-wired for sociability, attachment, as John Bowlby might have said, affection, companionship, and that the first drive is the drive to actually belong. It's an empathic drive.
So, Sherry, you're nodding along at the end there. Seems to make sense? Yeah?
Absolutely.
So here's what Rifkin tells us. He says, science shows that humans are wired for sociability. Humans are wired for attachment. Humans are wired for affection. They are wired for companionship. And that our first drive, our very first drive, is a drive to actually belong. It is, he says, an empathic drive. Mirror neurons create the impulse to connect, and that is why teams are so important in business. That is why identity is so important in business. That is why otherwise really smart people behave in ways that are not necessarily in their own interest. That's why people work a little harder so as not to disappoint the team. That is why people in combat risk their lives not for flag and country, but for the person next to them, the buddy in the foxhole. We are wired to be connected to others, and that results in some pretty peculiar behavior. That results in people wearing emblems of identity. Now, I happen to be an immigrant from Brazil, and I can attest my own people wear emblems of identity, and every Sunday in the winter, New Yorkers will wear emblems of their identity, but anywhere in the world you go, people will actually adorn themselves in peculiar ways to show whom they are in solidarity with. Even turning out into the streets for Football Club de Barcelona But I want you to note that even when situations are less pleasant than athletics, when, for example, people want to overthrow a dictator in Tahrir Square in Egypt, they also put themselves at risk to belong to something bigger than themselves. That human beings define themselves based on how they want to be seen and who they want to be seen with, and not necessarily based on what is in their immediate self-interest. Let me give you my favorite example of that. What's that? It's an iPhone. When this was introduced in June of 2007, lots and lots and lots of really, really smart people spent the night outside in big cities. Allegra, you're sort of slapping your knee. Okay. We'll get to you. They spent the night outside, sleeping on the street, waiting for the availability of this new phone. And here's the really interesting part. Every single one of those people already had a phone. They already had a phone. They didn't need a phone. They already had a phone. And at the time, this was a phone. It wasn't what it is now. It was just a phone. It was a particularly pretty phone. It was a particularly well-branded phone. It was a particularly fun to interact with phone. But it was a phone. And they waited through the night even though there was no indication that there would be any shortage, any reduction of supply. You'd be able to just go to the store and get a phone. You didn't have to wait overnight. You can come at 2 o'clock and there'd be phones. You can come at 5 o'clock and there'd be phones. You didn't have to wait through the night, but people did, because to do so was an emblem of identity. I am so cool. I waited through the night. So how is Apple's competitor now marketing themselves? Oh, it's your parents who wait through the night. The really cool people have the Galaxy. Identity matters because people connect emotionally, not rationally. One last thing about mirror neurons before we move on. Emotions are contagious. Emotions in the workplace are contagious. Confidence is contagious. Joy is contagious. Pride is contagious. Fear is contagious. Anxiety is contagious. Anger is contagious. And leaders need to recognize that when they exhibit these emotions, they invite others to share in their emotions. When they exhibit these emotions, they invite others to share in their emotions. And one of the burdens of leadership is to control our emotions so that we don't inadvertently trigger the opposite of what we're trying to get people to feel. We need to start with feeling and take it seriously. Many executives don't. Let's move on to the neuroscience of distraction. One of the things I hear from senior leaders all the time is, I've told them this 1,000 times and they don't get it. What's wrong with them, Leslie?
You haven't said it well enough. Wasn't paying attention.
Who wasn't paying attention?
The audience.
Why not?
You weren't connected.
Yes.
Communication doesn't happen until it's received.
It's until it's received, and what else?
Receive it.
Yeah, and internalized. But received is the first step. Sending is not the same as receiving. Receiving is not the same as accepting. But all too often, especially the higher and higher you go, but I've said it. I don't want to say it anymore. I'm tired of saying it. I've said it all I want to say. I'm not going to say it again. You've all heard that. In fact, some of you in this building, apparently. That is a common leader reaction. Leaders have a low tolerance for repetition. And the burden of leadership is to repeat. Can I say that again? The burden of leadership is to repeat. The burden of leadership is to repeat, but human beings are really bad at it. People have a really hard time paying attention. That is just part of the human condition. People have a very hard time paying attention, especially in the workplace. People have a very hard time paying attention, especially when they are tired, when they are angry, when they are anxious, when they are busy. In other words, whenever they're emotionally wrought, or when they are simply on task. When they are simply on task, they have a hard time paying attention. They have a very hard time paying attention. More about that in a moment. But here's what I find really interesting. Even when the stakes are very high to them, even when the stakes are personally very high, people have a very hard time paying attention. All of the research into what happens when a doctor gives a patient a diagnosis points to this. When a doctor tells a patient what is going on with the patient, 50% of what the doctor tells the patient is forgotten by the time the patient gets home. And of the 50% that is remembered, half of that is misremembered. Whoa, everybody's nodding their head. This is significant. Now, we know this, so we can develop strategies to counter this. So, we can ask the doctor to repeat it. We can write it down. We can ask the doctor to write it down. Notice when you leave the hospital, they write down when you're supposed to come back, because you're going to forget. You might even forget that they wrote it down. We can bring someone to the doctor with us to take notes, to have a second set of eyes and ears. We can adapt based on the recognition that we're likely to forget the really important stuff. Just as there are strategies for adapting to this, there are strategies for adapting to the natural tendency for people in the workplace to be distracted. So let's do an exercise. Let's play a game. I'm going to have you watch a videotape and count things. Now, if you've already seen this videotape, I'm going to ask you to so declare, so disclose, and I have another one for you. I have brought one for those who've already seen this tape. But here's the tape we're going to see, and Audrey, can I ask you to be our counter? I'm going to ask you to count and then report. I'm going to ask you to count not what we're going to see on the video. I'm going to ask you to count what the people who see the video say. I'm going to ask you to count something that happens, and it's a number between 0 and 20. You're going to see 6 people. 3 of them are wearing white T-shirts. Call them the white shirt team. 3 of them are wearing black T-shirts. Call them the black shirt team. Who's seen this video? Okay, you guys stay quiet. Everybody else, watch the video. Got another video for you. Each team has a basketball. You've seen this. Okay, please remain quiet. The teams are passing the basketball among members of the same team. So the white-shirted people are passing basketballs among white-shirted players. The black-shirted players are passing the basketball among other black-shirted players. I want you to count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. So your job, your task, is to count the number of times the players wearing white pass the basketball. So Allegra, what is your task?
Check how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
Very good. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
So Allegra, I need you to come up here. I'm done, not Allegra, I'm sorry, Audrey, I need you to come up here.
How many passes did you count?
Okay, don't say anything. Who counted 11 passes? You counted 11?
I did.
Okay, who counted, can you write down 11-1? Who counted 12? 2. 3. 3, did you count 12? 3 people counted 12. Who counted 13? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 people counted 13. Who counted 14? 1, 2. Who counted 15? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6. Who counted 16? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. Who counted 17? 18, 19. Okay. What are the final totals, Audrey?
11, one person. 12, 3 people. 13, 5 people. 14, 2 people. 15, 6 people. 16, 5 people.
Good. Here's the first thing I'd like to observe. This is the Financial Women's Association. I assume at least some of you are really good at math. But I note that we have a distribution of answers on something that isn't hard to calculate. Most of you are wrong. You just have to be. The numbers don't lie. So, I'm not making a value statement here. I'm simply observing most of you counted wrong, and it's not hard to count whatever number that is. I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
It was being blocked, so it made it hard.
So we're rationalizing away before we even know the answer. Right. So here's the short answer, and that is the correct answer is 15. So notice the pride of belonging to the group that got it right. So who counted correctly? Okay. Did you see the gorilla?
Yes.
Who did not see the gorilla? Oh, gorilla? Hands up. Who did not see the gorilla? Okay, about half the people who
counts one, apparently.
About half the people who had never seen the tape before did not see the gorilla. Some people saw it come on but ignored it. You saw something come on and you purposely ignored it. He's trying to trick me. Yes. Now, those who saw the gorilla for the first time, not the people who've seen the tape many times, those who saw the gorilla for the first time, what did it do? Allegra says it was doing a dance. Let's raise the roof. Allegra says it was doing a dance. Who else saw it do something? What did it do? It was going like this. Well, that's not what Allegra says. So you guys are going to fight with each other. So here's what I find.
I counted correctly.
Okay.
So maybe I got it right.
I can imagine a circumstance where people argue, no, it was 15, no, it was 13, no, it was 15, no, it was 13. Yes, there was a gorilla, no, there wasn't a gorilla. I saw the tape, there was no gorilla, yes, there was. The gorilla was dancing, no, the gorilla was pounding, no, the gorilla was dancing. We could actually have a fight about what we saw. That never happens in the business world. You don't come out of a staff meeting and then fight with your colleague about what really happened in the meeting. Never happens. Right. Because we are burdened by being human. So for those who did not see the gorilla, let's take a look.
But did you see the gorilla?
Yeah. Okay, Audrey, you can stay there because we have another one. So for everyone who's seen this tape before, we're going to do the same thing. But it's a new tape, so you don't know the answer. So this is for everybody now. 3 players wearing white, 3 players wearing black, 2 balls, and your task is to count how many times the ball passes between people in white shirts. Let's see whether we can have a little smaller distribution of answers.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball.
All right, before you say anything, how many passes did you count? Who counted 11? Who counted 12? Who counted 13? 2. Audrey, you can write that down. Who counted 14? 15. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 16. Everybody else. 17? 18? 19. Can we have the final count?
13, 2 people, 15, 5 people, 16, everybody else.
Good. The correct answer is, in fact, 16. Sorry, Allegra.
I know.
Yeah.
0 for 2.
0 for 2. But here's but here's the central question now. Did you see the gorilla? Who saw the gorilla? Everybody. Did you see the gorilla? Okay, everybody saw the gorilla. What did it do?
Found it.
Great. What else did you see?
Someone laughed or did something.
Someone laughed. Someone laughed. They did someone did something. Allegra has astute powers of observation. Right.
They did a dance. No.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Say more.
Someone in the black shirt exited.
One of the players left the stage. Who saw the player leave the stage? 3 people. What else did you see?
Color changed from red to yellow.
The curtain changed color.
Wow.
Christine is all messed up. Now, I can imagine an argument in the workplace. It did not change color. Yes, it did change color. What color did it change from and what color did it change to?
Red to yellow.
Red to yellow. Let's see who's right.
The correct answer is 16 passes.
Thank you, Audrey.
Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
It's kind of a hands up. Doesn't really laugh.
When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So let's talk about this. This actually is a non-trivial phenomenon that affects everybody here every day. And here's what it means. There is no such thing as multitasking. Are you saying yes there is, or you're agreeing with me? Okay, thank you. There is no such thing as multitasking. Because when we're doing one thing, we're not doing the other thing. When we're doing one thing, we're not doing the other thing. And we don't notice, even if it's something like a gorilla. We don't notice. Therefore, the single most common form of business communication is also the single least effective. And that's the conference call. Because every single person on the end of the phone is doing something else at the same time. And admit it, you do. Yes, you do. When you're on the conference call, you're checking email, you're reading the paper, you're making coffee, you're at home getting dressed, you're driving the car. I love being on conference calls and hearing people who forgot to turn the mute button on. Yeah. And you can tell nobody's paying attention. They're busy flushing toilets and making coffee and walking their dog, but they're not paying attention. Human beings have a very hard time doing 2 things at the same time. I spend a lot of time with the automobile insurance industry, and they are terrified. May I borrow this? They are terrified of this. They are terrified of this. And why are you doing this? Why are the...
It's not just that though. Even handless?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Right. Thank you. Because when we're doing one thing, we're not doing the other.
Can I say something?
Please.
I was driving.
Yeah.
I accidentally hit the thing that, there's no phone in my hands.
Mm-hmm.
My husband answers on the other end. I'm like, I'll be home, and I'm only a mile away. I missed the red light.
Yeah. And it's not you.
I didn't see it.
It's like the gorilla. You don't see it. It's not a visual thing. It's a cognitive thing. It is called cognitive tunneling. Cognitive tunneling, I'll be right there. Cognitive tunneling is when we're doing one thing, we're focused on it. And when we do that, we're not focused on the other thing. When we're talking on the phone, we're not focused on looking for the red light, even if we're hands-free. Yes, ma'am?
Is that necessarily negative? Does it just mean you're concentrating?
Ideally, you're concentrating on the right thing. But here's the challenge. When you are talking to your team, what are they doing? When you are talking to your team, what are they doing? And here's the challenge. If they're doing anything else, then they're not engaging optimally with you. And they're going to miss stuff. Yeah.
Do you have an ideal time for what people's attention span is?
15 seconds. You have 15 seconds to get and keep an audience's attention. You have 15 seconds to get and keep an audience's attention. And if you lose them in the first 15 seconds, it's really hard to get them back. Most leaders, most of the time, fail miserably at that. But let's stay on the very important question. But isn't it a good thing if they're focused? Yeah. But when they're focused, they don't pay attention to anything else. And if they're on deadline on a project and they still have to go to the meeting, they're going to work on their project and they're not going to hear anything that's happening in the meeting. They're going to be on task and therefore not multitasking. There's no such thing as multitasking. There's serially tasking in microbursts. And you're not good at any one of them when you're doing it in microbursts. But you're serially tasking in microbursts. There's no such thing as multitasking. Now, knowing this, there are strategies to deal with this. One of the strategies is to recognize whenever you're talking to a group of people at any given moment, some number of them are not hearing what you're saying. Some number of them are not paying attention. Therefore, we need to repeat important points. We also, is it Leon? Lenore, I'm sorry. To Lenore's question, when is the optimal time to get their attention? Within the first 15 seconds. So here are 3 ways to understand what human beings are capable of remembering. There are 3 effects that neuroscientists talk about that help us understand how to engage people so that they remember what we need them to remember. The first is called the primacy effect. People remember the first substantive thing they hear. So you ought to say the most important thing first. The second is called the frequency effect. People remember the thing they hear the most. So if there's something you want them to remember, say it first and then say it frequently. And finally, it's the recency effect. People remember the last thing they heard. Yeah. Primacy, frequency, recency. The burden of leadership is to say the most important thing when you have everyone's attention. First 15 seconds.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
What about, you're talking about what they hear. If you can't get someplace, you need to do, say, a WebEx so they get the visual while you're talking. You think that helps?
And I'm going to ask you to defer the question because I'm about to move on to what happens when the visual and the verbal aren't consistent with each other. Because that's what we're going to talk about next. But primacy, frequency, recency are among the ways to understand why we need to repeat things. So when leaders tell me, I hate repeating that, my response is, I don't care. It's not about you. It's about them, and they need to hear it. The other thing we know is human beings aren't going to remember anything unless they hear it at least 3 times. And most people are not paying attention all the time, so you need to say it more than 3 times for everyone to hear it at least 3 times. Yeah, that's really hard. Leaders hate that. I don't care. They need to do it anyway, because the burden of leadership is to actually connect with people. Now let's make this harder. Let's make it harder. Let's talk about what happens when you have to deal with the visual as well. So let me tell you a story about a client of mine. Client of mine is a manufacturing company, makes stuff everyone here knows, probably have it in your house. Can't tell you the company. They're having an investor meeting on Wall Street, actually at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, for investment analysts like people at Credit Suisse and people at Goldman Sachs and people at Bank of America, Merrill Lynch. Investors and investment analysts coming out to hear the company's leadership talk about the company. The CEO stands up and he talks about the strategy of the company. CFO stands up and talks about the financial condition of the company. And then they open it up for questions, and an analyst raises his hand. And he says, yeah, I know that you guys have been grappling with some quality control problems over the last few years. Can you give us an update on where you are on your quality problems? CEO looked out into the audience and said, yeah, we've had a quality task force working for the last several quarters. And actually, Jim, the guy who's running the task force, he's our president of manufacturing, he happens to be here today. Jim, why don't you come on up here, and why don't you brief us all on where we are on the quality initiative? Jim bounds up to the front of the room, stands in front of the investment analysts, and he says the following. Yeah, we've had a quality task force working for about 6 quarters, and I can report today that quality continues to improve every quarter. Continues to improve. Jim looked out and smiled. The CEO said, thanks, Jim. Jim went back to the audience, CEO nodded, CFO nodded. They assumed they had communicated. Next day, the analysts started putting out notes. We're not so confident in the company's ability to make its numbers because they haven't gotten their quality issues under control. Investor Relations calls up the analyst and says, hey, what's going on? Says, well, we heard Jim, and Jim said that you guys haven't gotten your quality problems under control. Investor Relations said, no, he didn't. He said that quality continues to improve every quarter. Analyst said, no, he didn't. Yes, he did. No, he didn't. Yes, he did. They had a fight. I got the call. I flew to the Midwest where the company is based. I put the videotape, that's back when we had videotapes, put the videotape in the machine, and I asked Jim, watch this. And Jim said, quality continues to improve every quarter. And I said, Jim, what's that? He said, that's quality, improving. I said, no, it's not. He said, yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. And I finally said, well, hold on, Jim. What do you mean by quality? He said, well, you know, quality. Because he's American and thinks if you say it louder that people will remember it. He says, you know, quality. Yeah, you've experienced that. Quality. And I said, no, I don't know. Assume I don't know. What is quality? I said, well, you know the number of defects per 1,000 units of production. I said, defects. Defects is a good thing. Quality is a good thing. Quality is a bad thing. Improvement ought to go up, not down. So Jim and his bosses was suffering from two things. The first is the curse of knowledge, where we know something so well we can't imagine someone else doesn't know it. That never happens in finance. And the second is misalignment of the visual and the verbal. Misalignment of the visual and the verbal. And what we find now from neuroscience is whenever there's misalignment of the visual and the verbal, the visual wins. Yeah, Lenore.
It reminds me of a technique about, when you're helping people speak to media, you don't want to repeat the negative.
Right.
So I thought he was going to say, yes, we've had a quality control
Problem, yeah.
That would have been like the worst.
Yeah, but this. So let's take a look at how the human brain processes misalignment between the visual and the verbal. And if you thought the gorilla was freaky, this is going to blow your mind. Okay? So I can confidently say this is going to blow your mind. So let's look at what happens whenever there's a misalignment of the visual and the verbal by looking at some excerpts from a BBC documentary about the human brain.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
So pay attention to this handsome gentleman with a beard, because all gentlemen with beards are handsome. Pay attention to this guy.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this.
Ba.
What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba.
Were you hearing something other than ba with a B? What were you hearing? And when I tell you the only sound that was being uttered was ba.
I actually closed my eyes and saw it the same. Really? Yeah, you should have.
I'm sorry, what did you hear when you closed your eyes?
Fa.
You did not hear fa.
I did not hear fa.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to hold on to that for a second. The only sound that was uttered was ba. and you can fight with each other. No, I was there. I heard it. So now, I'll tell you why. But now, we're going to put both things next to each other. You can go back and forth at will. From ba to fa to ba to fa. And then they're going to get in really close. And notice that every time he says either ba or fa, he says it 3 times. I'm going to ask you, anytime he says ba, on any one of the times he says ba, close your eyes, and what do you hear in the second and third? So let's watch.
Ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba.
Take another look.
Ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba.
Now to the left of the screen.
Ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
Ba. In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba.
Say more, Sherry.
It's crazy. I mean, when you close your eyes, you really can hear. But even if you know he's not saying.
You even know he's not saying it. So you fight with yourself. You still hear it even if you know that that's not really what you're hearing. Does this blow your mind? Yeah. But there's an override. But this is actually huge in the workplace. This is huge in the workplace. Whenever there's a misalignment of the verbal and the visual wins. So, my door is always open. You can come and see me anytime. I'm so sorry that happened. Facial expression has to align with what's being said, or else people will not hear what is being said. They will hear something else. Whenever there's a misalignment of the verbal and the visual wins. Here's the science.
The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. The speech brain just takes in that information and doesn't care about what outside knowledge you bring to bear. Ba, 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 ba.
The McGurk effect shows us that what we hear may not always be the truth. But it also helps us to understand what happens when our senses conflict.
Ba, ba, ba. When the brain has the conflicting information, it tries to make sense of that conflict. And depending on what type of modality is providing more, salient information, that information might override or at least combine with the other information.
So we can't always trust what we hear, because sometimes our sense of vision takes over, enabling us to maintain a coherent view.
This is especially the case when the speaker has PowerPoint. And what's behind that hearty chuckle?
This is funny.
The visual of PowerPoint can help, but it can also interfere. And there are good books on how to do PowerPoint, and I commend you to them. But in financial institutions in particular, when you have a slide that has 400 data points, 7 charts, 15 lines of text, and 4 different colors, what are you supposed to remember? People just shut down. Having said that, let's move on. A quick process check. I've checked with Credit Suisse. We're going to run about 10 minutes late. If you need to leave on time, feel free to do so. I won't take offense. But we are going to adjourn about 10 minutes after 8, not precisely at 8. Let's look at the neuroscience of retention and how people actually understand what you want them to or the opposite. Remember Jim, quality continues to improve. People took exactly the wrong impression because the visual imagery was so powerful. The same thing happens when we use verbal engagement. We need to get the verbal engagement right as well. And here's the key for content. Is that a no we don't or yes we do? Okay. And that is meaning is determined by context. Meaning is determined by context. Meaning is determined by context, and facts by themselves are not persuasive. Facts alone are not persuasive. In order to manage meaning effectively, in order to lead people to a true and authentic conclusion, we need to begin with frames of reference that establish a context. And then we need to move to the facts. Now, what are frames of reference? According to the cognitive linguist George Lakoff at Berkeley, frames are mental structures triggered by language or by images or by metaphors. And when a frame is triggered, an entire worldview is triggered, and that determines the meaning of what comes next. Quality continues to improve every quarter, determine the meaning of everything that followed. And once people are in one frame, they will understand what is within that frame. They will not understand anything that is beyond that frame. Let's look at an example. This is from a study at Stanford University by two prominent psychologists. They wanted to understand the relationship of facts to frames. So they took a very bright group, Stanford undergraduates. They took a lot of them, and they subjected them to an experiment where they told a story with exactly the same facts, but with two different introductions. Half the group got one introduction, half the group got another introduction, but the facts were identical. Then they asked them questions, and I'm going to work the same experiment with you. So, they wanted people to respond to a narrative based on something they might understand, so they chose crime in an urban setting, figuring even if the people had never lived in a city, they'd probably watch TV, something like Law and Order or CSI or the news, and they had some sense of crime. They described crime in a fictional city called Addison, and to half the group they described crime as a wild beast preying on the city. To the other half they described crime as a virus infecting the city. Then they gave exactly the same facts in exactly the same sequence at exactly the same time. And then they asked questions. So here's how they described crime as a wild beast. They said crime is a wild beast preying on the city of Addison. The crime rate in this once peaceful city has steadily increased over the last 3 years. In fact, these days it seems that crime is lurking in every neighborhood. And then they gave the facts. In 2004, 46,177 crimes were reported, compared to more than 55,000 reported in 2007. The rise in violent crime is particularly alarming. In 2004, there were 330 murders in the city. In 2007, there were over 500. Then they asked, in your opinion, what does Addison need to do to reduce crime? What do you think they said? Kill the beast. What does that mean in terms of public policy? How do you do that? Punishment. What kind of punishment? Okay. What else? Jail. What else? More cops. So the public policy solutions here are law enforcement punishment solutions. Cops, jail, even capital punishment. Well, let's see what the Stanford undergraduate said. They said, yeah, first we've got to catch the criminals. Then we've got to put them in jail. Then we need to pass tougher laws, probably with mandatory minimums. The other half got a different introduction. The other half were told crime is a virus infecting the city of Addison. The crime rate in this once peaceful city has steadily increased over the last 3 years. In fact, these days it seems that crime is plaguing every neighborhood, Sherry. And then they gave the facts. In 2004, 46,177 crimes were committed, compared to more than 55,000 reported in 2007. The rise in violent crime is particularly alarming. In 2004, there were 330 murders in the city. In 2007, there were more than 500. In your opinion, what should Addison do to reduce crime? What do you think they said? Treat the problem, inoculate the people, get more doctors. What is the public policy solution to that? How do you do this from a public policy? Who said education? Yeah. So here's what they said. They said the first thing you got to do is understand why. So they don't go to punishment, they go to diagnosis. Why? Then they said it probably has something to do with some social dislocation. So we've got to fix whatever the underlying social issues are. It probably has to do with poverty. And what is the way out of poverty? It's education. So the public policy solution here is build more schools. Sherry?
It's crazy.
It's crazy. What's crazy?
Just the way you introduce something.
The way you introduce it changes everything.
Yeah.
But here's my favorite part. Here's my favorite part. Here's my favorite part. Why? They ask people why. Why, when crime is described as a wild beast preying on the city, do you say more cops, kill the beast, more jails, tougher laws? Why? And the answer they gave is, well, because of the crime statistics. Weren't you paying attention? But when they introduced crime as a virus plaguing the city, they said, why? Why diagnose the problem? Why social reforms? Why education? Because of the crime statistics. Weren't you paying attention? What this points to is we make choices based on our emotional reaction to the frame. But we're not aware that we're doing it. So when we're asked to justify, we justify by reference to the facts. And here's the other lesson. What makes sense is what is consistent with the frame. So, Allegra, crime is a wild beast preying on the city, but I've got a solution. Build more schools. Doesn't make any sense.
What are you going to do about the beast?
Right. That won't solve the problem. What's wrong with you? By the same token, Juliana, crime is a virus infecting the city, but I've got the solution. More jails. Doesn't make any sense. What makes sense is what works within the frame. And anything outside the frame doesn't make any sense. You can actually understand most American politics as the battle to control the frame. But this isn't a seminar on politics. It is possible to reframe, and I have to say, and you're Credit Suisse, so I'm going to point to the clock and say, we don't have time to do that other than to say that in Chapter 8 of The Power of Communication, we talk about how to do that. But let me say this. It is easier to establish the right frame than to have to reframe, and here's the lesson. If we simply give facts, people are going to introduce their own frame. Oh. So the discipline of effective leaders is to get the sequence right. Most technical experts get the sequence backward. They either start with the facts and back into a frame, but by then it's too late, or they forget the frame altogether. They need to start with a frame and then move to the facts. And let me give you a case study, and then we're going to adjourn. Let me tell you a story about the then CEO of Citibank. Who here is from Citibank?
I used to be there.
You used to be there. Okay. In 1992, they were my client. And the CEO, John Reed, had a tough job. As you recall, some of you recall, in the late 1980s, there had been a banking crisis. Banks had gone under, lots of government takeovers, savings and loans had gone under, the economy tanked, it was horrible. Citibank stock had gone from 75 to 6.25. And it was the first time we heard the phrase too big to fail, which doesn't mean it's too big to fail, it means it's too big for us to allow to fail. We began to hear that back then. John Reed, the CEO of Citibank, came up with a turnaround plan. And the turnaround plan was a 5-point plan. He said, look, We've got a plan to turn the bank around. It's 5 steps. The first is we're going to focus on the short term because we have to survive before we can thrive. So every decision we're going to make over the next 2 years is all about short-term survival. Number 2, we're going to build our capital base. Number 3, we're going to get out of non-core businesses. Number 4, we're going to reduce expenses dramatically. And number 5, we do need to invest somewhere, and that's in customer service because we need people to continue to come to the bank. That's our plan. Analysts said, yeah, thanks a lot. It was a big yawn. About 3 months later, Citicorp decided to suspend its dividend. Who here's in the stock market? Who here works in equities? What happens when you suspend the dividend?
People don't invest.
People don't invest. What happens to the stock?
Goes down.
Why?
Because people aren't investing.
Because people aren't, or they're selling. People lose confidence in the company, they sell. So Citibank decides to suspend its dividend. I happened to be in the meeting when Mr. Reed was breaking the news to the investment community. So here's what he said. He said, remember our 5-point plan? Remember we have to focus on short-term survival before we can thrive? Remember we said a key part of our plan is to rebuild our capital base? Well, today I'm here to announce that our board of directors has decided to invest our profits into our capital base. But the result of that is we need to temporarily suspend the dividend. Yeah, that's going to inconvenience some of our shareholders, especially those that are income-driven, but it's the responsible choice, and here's why. If we don't reinvest our profits into our capital base, we're not going to be around in 2 years. I was sitting in the back of the room, manning a bank of telephones, because there weren't cell phones back then. Cell phones were the size of bricks. And the investment analysts ran to the back of the room, and I heard them on the phone. And here's, Sherry, what they were saying. They were saying Citibank is serious about the turnaround plan. Citibank is reinvesting its profits into its capital base, and the stock rallied. It was the first time the stock had gone up. Couple of months later, they decided to sell the company they had bought a couple of years earlier named Quotron. They had spent $2 billion for Quotron. They were going to sell it for $500 million. They were going to take $1.5 billion loss, but they're going to get $500 million in cash. They announced it. Remember our turnaround plan? Remember short term? Remember build our capital base? Remember get out of non-core businesses? We don't need Quotron. It's an information service. We don't need it to be a bank. So we're getting rid of it. We're going to get $500 million in cash. We're going to put it into our capital base. Stock goes up. Stock continued to go up. The more he framed business decisions as being part of this plan, people said, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. What makes sense is what makes sense within a frame. I just had someone come in and say, cut it off, so I'm going to cut it off. So let me offer the following. The burden of leadership is to actually move people to think and feel and know and do what you want them to. It's not about pushing facts at them. It's not about pushing message at them. It's not about telling our story. It's about understanding how human beings can actually accept information, process information, remember it, and act on it. It's not about telling. It's about getting people to want to receive it and to process it. The burden of an effective leader is to get good at engaging people well. Per Warren Buffett, if you do that, you can increase your value in the marketplace by 50%. Per the Center for Talent Innovation, if you do that, you enhance the likelihood of getting promoted because 26% of the promotion is based on that kind of stuff. So let me commend to you the burden of leadership is to take communication as seriously as you take everything else. And the starting point is to move people, you need to meet them where they are, but that means you have to know how to meet them, know what they care about, and then invite them to come with you. You connect emotionally, you move them intellectually. With that, I'd like to thank the Financial Women's Association. I'd like to thank Credit Suisse. And I'd like to thank each of you for hanging out this long. Thank you very much. Hi. How are you? Good to see you.